a Superman action figure in a toy coffin, a blue shirt and red jacket, a first flight in the sun above the Arctic tundra. These are some of the moments that define my Superman fandom. Together on this podcast, we journey across time and media to examine, discover, and reconsider the creative visions that have shaped the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. This is part 3 of 8 of Crisis Till Death. And this episode, joining me to discuss the 1988 Ruby Spears Superman cartoon is returning guest, Jeremy Frutkin. Welcome.
Anthony, pleasure to be here as always, my friend. And the way you and I have been talking about the 80s, I'm thinking I should bring the mullet back. It's becoming a theme with you and I.
Well, let's just wait until we get to the death and return of Superman. Although it really wasn't meant to be a mullet, but I know that's how a lot of people tend to kind of look at it as. But yeah, just give it a few more episodes and you'll be good to go.
Maybe my hair will match the style by then. We'll see.
There you go.
I just heard my wife get mad from downstairs, all the way downstairs when I said that.
So, the audience might recall that I did a mini episode on the Ruby Spears Superman cartoon months and months ago with Rich Roney. And we just did about a half hour. And I'll summarize that episode in about one sentence here. Basically, it came down to Rich and I were just shocked that this cartoon existed, and we had never known about it prior to doing that episode. We had both come across it in an article that was like counting down some of the best Superman adaptations. And he and I, each separately kind of had a moment where we're like, wait a minute, what's that? So before we even get any further in this conversation, and I know the answer, but for our audience, when did you learn about this, the existence of this cartoon, Jeremy?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Anthony. It was a very formative moment in my life. It was when you asked me about doing this episode. And you said, hey, I only recently found out that this show existed. And I responded, I just found out now when you told me. So here I am. And again, because of you, I got to examine and learn and experience something new. So that alone, win, lose, or draw, is worth the price of admission to me. But yeah, I would really be shocked if a lot of our listeners had heard of the show before that first conversation that you had.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I'll say this, once I put out that mini episode months ago on YouTube in particular, and funny enough, I won't lie, this was one of the reasons why I always wanted to revisit it. It was of the video podcasts. Most of my audience consumes the audio editions, but I do put out video versions on YouTube. And far and away, the most watched video podcast was the one on the Ruby Spears cartoon. So I was like, there seems to be a bit of an interest in this. And there were a bunch of people, and this was a really cool aspect of doing that episode, was a bunch of people commented, and look, it would have been real easy for them to be like, hey, dumbass, didn't you know, why didn't you know about this cartoon? But it couldn't have been further from that. Everyone was really nice. And there were a bunch of people who were like, yeah, like, I remember watching this as a kid, and like, I tell people about it and they're like, what are you talking about? So,
that's amazing.
So like there are people who definitely have the memory of growing up watching it. And now it is available on DVD and on the streaming, the ad-supported streaming site Tubi. They're not one of our sponsors, but just to let you know where you can watch it. Yet. Well, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see how many YouTube views this racks up. Maybe we'll get them for the next episode.
Share and subscribe, people. You know the deal.
There you go. But yeah, so like there definitely are people out there who remember it, and a lot of people wrote in the comment section of that, and that was really cool. And when I did that mini episode, I had only watched, I think, 3 episodes, 3 out of the 13. And so kind of in the back of my mind, I was always like, well, I'll go back to it and I'll do a true deep dive and I'll watch all the episodes. And it ended up fitting really perfectly here in the midst of this 8-part event that I'm doing, where we're examining the period of time following Crisis on Infinite Earths up to and including the death and return of Superman. And, we just spent 2 episodes talking about the Byrne era of the comics. We talked about Byrne's work on Superman and Action, as well as Marv Wolfman and Jerry Ordway, and later Byrne himself on Adventures of Superman. So that was the past 2 episodes. And like right after that, like I think right around the time that Byrne's comics run ended, we had this cartoon. And when you talk about, other media adaptations of Superman in this Crisis Till Death period, there's not a ton. You know, there's Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, which came out in 87, but that was, you know, the unfortunate conclusion to a movie series that began, you know, much earlier. And you also had the Superboy TV series, which I have not forgotten about, but that deserves its own discussion, and that will come probably next year. But there too, you know, that was, you know, a show about Superboy, an aspect of the character that post-Crisis no longer existed. So that's a little bit of an outlier. So, and then Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman would come in 93, which is after the period of time that we're talking about.
I felt a shudder when you said that.
And, well, we're going to talk about Lois and Clark on the show down the line. It's all good. And, but so within this period of time, you know, this Ruby Spears cartoon, again, was not the only adaptation, but was definitely an interesting one for reasons that we'll discuss. And it felt like it warranted a full episode. And so that's why I ended up doing this episode and why we're doing it here and now.
One of the things, aside from how much I enjoy being a guest on this show and talking to you, one of the main things that appealed to me about this so much is if you look at our respective ages and when this show came out, it is very possible that you and I could have been kids bopping around the house, and this could have been on TV. And I thought that was actually a pretty cool way. And that's kind of how I went to approaching this whole assignment, if you will, to do all of this. You know, part of me almost as a gag wanted to have a bowl of cereal here waiting, and we could just kind of, you know, do Saturday morning cartoons. But the ASMR folks might have liked that if I was eating cereal, but I'll spare everybody else that. We just have some you know, adult treats instead. My point being, it would be very, very easy for me to look at this show in 2021 and be like, oh, this is a silly 80s show. And, you know, it's just, they're so out of touch and there's nothing to kind of get from this whole thing now. I always, like you, I try to find the positive in everything that I do and that we do here. I think the show is so interesting because there's a lot of it that I found laborious, to be perfectly honest with you. But there was some stuff that they did that I did find interesting and I did find worthwhile. And had it not been for you, I wouldn't have had that experience. So thank you for that. And also, I'd like to throw out, we did mention that the majority, all but I think 2 or 3 episodes are on Tubi. Tubi is completely free of charge. So even if you want to hit pause right now and watch an episode or two, they're pretty quick. And it's just such an easy access point to join our conversation here as well, which I think is always worth mentioning. Price of admission is $0. It costs nothing to download and watch Tubi, and you can see exactly what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, for anyone who, I mean, I'll say this because I think you and I are pretty similarly aligned in terms of how we felt about this cartoon. You know, as a lifelong Superman fan, I'm happy that I've closed that little gap in my fandom and that I've watched all of the episodes. And there's a lot about it that is pretty cool. But at the same time, you know, we talked about this off mic, you know, to be watching it, you know, in our mid 30s in 2021, you know, for the first time without having the personal attachment to a memory of watching it as a kid.
That's right.
You know, I was not on the edge of my seat watching this, and I, you know, I won't lie. There were certain points where it became a little bit of a slog, but overall, again, it was a worthwhile exercise. And I will say, if you're a Superman fan listening to or watching this podcast, and I assume you are, unless you just like hearing me talk, which I appreciate, but chances are you like Superman. And if you've never watched this cartoon, at least watch an episode. I mean, true. I mean, I think just, again, especially if you're not familiar with it, if you didn't know it existed like us, I mean, it's definitely worth a watch. It deserves its place in the Superman canon. It earned at least that much. Yeah.
I agree. And it cost $0 and 0 cents
on Tubi
to come along with us on Tubi to come along with this journey, which I think is cool. But I mean, I agree. You hit the nail on the head. It's an interesting piece and obviously not completely forgotten, but sometimes perhaps overlooked is maybe the better word, piece of Superman's history.
That is a perfect word. And I think that's why, because, you know, when I first discovered this, I was like, wow, how did I miss this? And I think overlooked is the right word, because it's like, for all that I've read about Superman, and, you know, there've been various documentaries and things like that. I mean, I can't think of any instances where I've come across that because I feel like I would have clocked it and I would have been like, oh, let me look into that. Like I said, it is available on DVD, and that was how I watched it. I did track down the DVD. I don't think it's out of print. I think I got it on Amazon. It's all 13 episodes are there. There's one special feature about greed and the rise of this version of Lex Luthor, but it's so tangentially related to the actual character of Lex. It's really more about societal changes in the 80s into the 90s. It was
oh boy,
it was kind of odd. I don't know how that ended up on the DVD, to be perfectly honest. Like, the connection to the comics, it was so tenuous. But look, you can get all the episodes on the DVD if you want to have it on your shelf, as I do on mine. But, so the animated series that we're talking about is the 1988 Ruby Spears Superman show, just simply called Superman. And it aired only 13 episodes and this was on Saturday mornings on CBS from September 17th, 1988 to December 10th, 1988. So September to December 1988, 13 episodes. That's it.
Blink of an eye.
Blink of an eye. So, I mean, you
Yeah.
and I were really, really little kids. I mean, it's possible that we, stumbled across an episode at some point. I certainly have no memory of it if I did. I mean,
Same.
I was 1, so no idea.
I think I would have been 3. So yeah, I still have no memory of it whatsoever.
Yeah. But again, it's a part of the Superman canon. And well, I guess before we talk about the show, specifically, again, Saturday morning cartoons or weekday afternoon cartoons. I know that's a big thing for a lot of people. It was for me. What were your go-tos? Clearly it wasn't this show, but like, what were the go-tos?
You already know what my answer is going to be, and I love you for that, because I was such a huge fan of Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, leading into Justice League, and then Justice League Unlimited. Those are I'd say those and X-Men the Animated Series are probably my favorite comic book adaptations in animation of all time. And as much as I love the X-Men Animated Series, just the lineage that went on for over a decade from, starting with Batman the Animated Series to Justice League Unlimited is just, it's that storytelling that you can only really get from television, which I appreciate, where they were just telling a story years and years and years. And it's easy for people who maybe aren't into animation to look at it and be like, oh, that's a kid's show. But they were growing and evolving these characters for us over years as kind of we were getting older too, which is what I think a lot of the comic books I like. And people have heard me talk about my epiphany last time I spoke with you about how much I love the Titans, apparently, because I like seeing that character growth. And that's kind of the same way I feel about this. And I would find it very hard to believe that listeners of this show haven't at least seen some of what I just mentioned. But if you haven't, please, by all means, go and seek them out. By all means, they're such a formative part of me growing up, my childhood, and even into early adulthood. I was still watching Justice League Unlimited when I was in college, I believe. So that was, and I've watched it since. Even still, that's a series I'll always go back to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. It's been a little while since I've gone back to the Bruce Timm cartoons, although not too long, because when you and I did our look at the post-crisis Superman origins, I did rewatch the first 3 episodes of Superman the Animated Series.
Yep.
And they held up great. And yes, I do have that attachment to watching them as a kid, like yourself. I mean, I watched those when they originally aired. But I feel like even if I didn't have that, I think they would still resonate with me. And I think those shows really work well, whether you're a kid watching it like we were when we first did, or, you're watching it, as an adult, either for the first time or revisiting it. I think it works on a lot of levels in a way that most other shows don't.
Absolutely.
So
animation or not.
Animation or not, but very, very true. It's funny though, I was even thinking of stuff earlier than that. Like, I always felt like I was born in 87. I always felt like I missed the boat on, like G.I. Joe and Transformers.
Me too.
Because like, I remember
I was born 85, but yeah, same.
Because I remember guys at the comic shop that I worked at who were like just a few years older than me. Well, not that much, but like a few years older. And, they had really been into that. And it was just not a thing for me.
Yeah. Growing up, really, because if you think about like when I was like at a formative age, I was 5 in 1990. For me, it was really Batman, Superman, X-Men, and Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And that was like the predominant, between the comic books, the toys, which is funny because I have an interesting segue about toys and this show that I have a question that I don't know if I'll ever get the answer to, but a little bit of foreshadowing there. But yes, so for me, I missed the boat on all those too. And it's so funny what a difference just a few years can make in kind of like the cultural zeitgeist of everything.
Yeah, 100%. So again, like you, I watched all the Bruce Timm cartoons, but that was a little, I mean, you know, I was in, you know, grade school and then into high school, even with Justice League Unlimited and stuff like that. But, I mean, as a kid, I definitely remember, you know, Darkwing Duck and like that sort of stuff.
Let's get dangerous.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And in looking up Ruby Spears, I saw that they did the Mega Man series, which I was, and that brought, when I read that,
super fighting robot, Mega Man.
I was into, you know, and I'm not, I know you're a gamer. I'm not now, but as a kid, I mean, I had the Super Nintendo was like I guess my favorite. And then I had PlayStation and PlayStation 2, but like Super Nintendo was when I was at the height of my gaming.
Super Nintendo is my pick for the overall greatest system of all time. So you're right on the money.
Right on. And I remember I making Mega Man X and the subsequent games. Like I was really into that. And I watched the animated series. So while I didn't watch Ruby Spears and their Superman work, I did watch Mega Man.
Oh yeah, I did too, with Dr. Light and Rush the robotic dog, and it was good stuff, fun stuff.
Yeah, Mega Man was great. And then honestly though, for me in the early part of my childhood, my favorite cartoon was a live action cartoon, Power Rangers. Were you into Power Rangers? Yeah.
Oh, I would be, and I feel like I've used this line already, but I would be hard pressed to find anybody our age who didn't love Power Rangers as a kid. And if they're telling you otherwise, they're probably lying. Because let me tell you, when it was time to go out and like first, second, third grade out to the playground, you better believe we were all playing Power Rangers, and that was it.
Right on. I remember this. I switched schools. I switched elementary schools between first and second grade. And I remember the summer before second grade going to look at the new school with my parents. And the principal was showing us around. And I remember asking about what time school ended because I needed to get home in time to watch Power Rangers. That's
amazing. That's like a soundbite for a documentary if I've ever heard one. That's just, and you're not alone in that thought too. That's amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, I was, you know, again, we're talking here now the early 90s. I mean, and I was not like, I was so high tech, but I mean, I was a little kid with the VCR. I mean, I was taping stuff all the, you know, especially Power Rangers. I was not going to miss that.
Do you remember how hard it was to get those toys on Christmas?
Yes.
And like the shortage and like I'm assuming all of our parents were like scrambling around and trying to find stuff. It was, again, such a phenomenon that how probably, to your point, people a few years older than us were with G.I. Joe and maybe even something like He-Man or Thundercats, kind of like in that era, which I also missed the bonus too, is kind of how we were with Power Rangers. I mean, listen, I had, you know, the Green Ranger's little dagger that you could like play like a flute and like make noises out of. And it was just the coolest thing ever, you know?
I think I've told the story on a different podcast, but I remember at one point, because, you know, they used to do those sweepstakes, like you could win like a whole set of toys.
Yep.
And I remember once I don't know what filled me with this confidence, but I was convinced that I was going to win, to the point where I think like my mom was like, oh, like we can go get a toy. And I was like, no, like I'm going to win the sweepstakes. I don't know what made me think that. And I didn't win, but boy, that would have been great. I was going to say,
you manifested it and you won. I was like, listen, Anthony, when we're done here, we're going to go get a lotto ticket and you're just going to tell me which numbers to pick and we're going to will it into existence and we're going to be set. It's going to be great.
That would be amazing.
Who is your favorite Power Ranger? I'm going to guess Red Ranger.
No, I mean, I did quite like Jason, but I mean, I'll be kind of cliche, but no, Tommy was my favorite. I think it's most people's
because
favorite.
Tommy was the coolest. Do you like him better as Green Ranger or White Ranger?
Oh, that's a good question. I would actually probably say White, to be honest, which I know that might be a little, yeah.
I mean, when he came back, it was just the coolest ever. He had the whole new outfit, and suddenly I realized after the past few minutes, we turned this into a Power Rangers podcast.
It's, you know what?
Boy, nostalgia, huh?
I think it's fitting that we had that conversation because, you know, again, we didn't have that experience with the Ruby Spears cartoon, but there might be people listening to this who did. And so I think they would identify with what we're talking about.
Sure.
And
the feeling and sentiment is the same.
Exactly. And so, so that's why, I'm happy to shine a light on this cartoon. And I've now watched, because again, I have the DVD. I've watched all 13 episodes. I know you've watched the 11 that Tubi has. I couldn't tell you why
That's
they're
correct.
missing the 2 that they are, but whatever.
I still have not found an answer. I was convinced I was going to find some interesting conspiracy about what happened, but I have not been able to find an answer. If anybody listening, please drop us a line and let us know why these 2 episodes aren't on Tubi, because I'm legitimately curious to know.
So kind of on the note of the behind the scenes and the production, let me say this. It was kind of hard to really even find anything about this show. There's not a ton of information out there. So, I mean, we know, when it aired and all of that. And it aired, 1988 was the 50th anniversary of Superman's debut in 1938. So it was a big deal in that sense. And it only ran 13 episodes. Now, I've heard conflicting things. I don't have a definitive answer on this. I was hoping to be able to deliver to the audience a definitive answer, and unfortunately I don't have one. So the best I can do is present what I've heard, and, you can kind of draw your own conclusions. So some of the articles, and again, there's not a ton, but I found a few articles, and there's a Wikipedia page, and some of the articles had people commenting, and one school of thought, the prevailing school of thought, seems to be that the show was canceled as a result of a high licensing fee that DC charged, and or low ratings. And the low ratings are attributed to the time that the show aired. Apparently it was like 8:30 a.m. Eastern, which is on the earlier side. And
Definitely.
it was apparently also up against this. And now for us with kids, it's like, that doesn't seem so early, but at the time.
We're on that young child schedule. Like we're beating the sun left, right, and center over here.
But at the time, I guess that was on the earlier side, and it was also up against Winnie the Pooh, which I suppose was a bit of a ratings
big
juggernaut.
Fluffy juggernaut. Yeah, there you go. Perfect word for it.
So that was kind of the main. I guess the main information that I gathered, that it was canceled as a result of low ratings due to the time and its competition. And there was also the matter of this licensing fee. However, very interestingly, going back to the comments on the YouTube video for my prior podcast, someone commented and said that the show didn't fail. Rather, it was only ever intended to be 13 episodes. And this person shared a little bit of background and said that CBS had gone to DC and wanted to do a Superman cartoon as far back as 1985, so a few years earlier. And DC was resistant because this was right around the time of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they knew that their continuity was going to be shifting, and they didn't want to kind of have a version of the character out there that was no longer going to be relevant or applicable. So they kind of like pushed back on it. And eventually, I guess within those few years, the agreement they came to was, okay, 13 episodes, and only 13 episodes, and it will sort of incorporate various aspects of the 50 years of Superman's history. And we'll talk more about that, because I think that is the most fascinating aspect of the cartoon, is how it weaves different elements together. So I want to circle back to that. So that YouTuber shared that bit. I did respond, and I said, nicely, I was like, but do you have a source, or did you work on the show? Because they spoke about it with such authority that I thought that might even be possible, but I didn't get a response, so I don't know, and I wouldn't feel comfortable enough to say, hey, this is the fact of the matter. I don't know, but these are a couple of possibilities. So it might have been canceled, or it might have been that it was only meant to be 13, and I think you have a theory or a take on that.
I do, and I also love that you just described the internet as a whole, kind of, with that whole story, which I think is just perfect, especially in today's age. But yeah, so you and I had spoke already, and I kind of got the theory that it really seems like that either it was intended, and again, I don't know anything either ostensibly, I'm just speculating, but it really does seem like it was either intended to just be these episodes, or at some point early on, maybe they found out it was going to be these episodes. And just the stuff that kind of maybe go down that rabbit hole was, you look at the Superman backup stories, right? That the photo album stories that happens at the end, right?
Yeah. So just as, I don't mean to cut you off, but just for anyone who hasn't watched one of these. So one of the things, and we'll talk more about these little vignettes a little bit later on, but one of the things that's like really I was going to say super interesting, really interesting about this cartoon, and I do think this is kind of unusual for a kid's cartoon, is that The first 18 minutes would be your main Superman action story. And then the last 4 minutes of every episode would be reserved for these 4-minute vignettes, the Superman's Family Album. And they would each tell just a quick story about Clark growing up, all the way from his adoption through his debut as Superman. And there were a bunch of stops along the way. But so each episode had this 4-minute vignette.
And I actually love that they did that, because that format is something that I still think is still relatively uncommon now, but I would imagine back then was, still maybe a revolutionary-ish kind of thing. I don't have enough data to say that it never happened before that, but I thought that was kind of unique and kind of cool. But what interests me is that you start at the very beginning in that episode, and then the very last one that you see is his first appearance as Superman. So I don't know where you go after that. I mean, do you transfer again, you can make the argument that in a subsequent season, you would just make those last 4 minutes a different story about something else. But it really does seem like a definitive end when you get to that point, because they're almost at the same point, both on the B side and the A side of the show. They kind of converge close enough in time. So also the other thing that kind of lends my theory is that as you watch these episodes, I feel like, and this is actually a part I enjoyed, the masochist that I am, that it got more off the rails the further it got. I don't want to say that these people didn't care, but I feel like it's almost like they were just like, we're just going to tell whatever stories you want to tell, right? Because in the beginning, you do have Lex Luthor. You have a lot of recognizable Superman stories and motifs. And then by the end of it, Superman's in a space alien bar, and there are just fights breaking out. And there's all these like very heavy, high concept sci-fi kind of themes and motifs going on that I don't necessarily associate with Superman immediately, especially when it's being put out to children in a broad audience. So it's a fascinating experiment just to go and watch these episodes as they unfold, because it goes some places that I would not expect the show to go.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that Bone Chill, Dr. Morpheus, Wild Shark, you're saying that these villains haven't earned a spot in the pantheon of the Superman Rogues Gallery?
Well, I mean, I actually have a wild shark tattoo, but other than that, no. Like, what are we doing? Like, that's not exactly right.
This cartoon made a big impression on Jeremy. He never heard about it before, but once he got to that wild shark episode, he was like, man.
I ran down here in Charleston. I ran to the tattoo parlor and I said, "Wild, give me this bland underwater pirate tattoo right now. That's what I need."
Yeah. So yeah, and we'll talk about the arc of the stories, but especially as far as those vignettes go, it's like, yeah, we do go from adoption through debut as Superman. So the vignettes in particular really do have an arc and a sense of completion to them. Sure. Now, had there been another season, either, they could have filled in other gaps or maybe just ditched that, or, they could have done any number of things, but there might be something to that. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible that if we were to try to reconcile these somewhat conflicting accounts, I mean, it could be that, DC didn't really want to do it, so they charged a very high licensing fee, and the understanding was they would kind of only do 13, and maybe the ratings were sort of so-so, maybe not bad enough to get canceled, but not great enough that they would try to work something out for more. I mean, I don't know. That's my attempt at trying to, kind of weave all of this together. I don't really know for sure, but those were the things that I came across that I figured I would present.
Yeah, no, it's all very interesting and worthy of discussion. So my big question is, did we ever find out definitively, were there action figures put out of this show?
Okay, so wait, let me say one more thing just as far as the production, because this is, I think, for comics fans, I think would really find this interesting, is that Marv Wolfman was the story editor. And
I have that written down in my notes as well, too, and some fun bits. Yeah, how about that, huh? Yeah. That's pretty surprising.
And comic book artist Gil Kane did all the character designs. So, the comic book pedigree, was really here for this.
So I found a very interesting story on cartoonresearch.com is what it was. Let me make sure I got that right. Cartoonresearch.com had a very cool little article about it. And nothing like maybe necessarily as like mind-blowing as we would have hoped, but they had a bunch of kind of like these interesting nuggets. And one of the things that they had actually was Marv Wolfman being involved. And supposedly at the time, the writer of the show, Andy Mangels, called him up and said, oh, like I heard that like, Superman, like you're a pretty good writer, do you want to come on the show? And Marv Wolfman kind of paused and was like, yeah, okay, like I'll do that. But Marv Wolfman legitimately believes that he had no idea about his comic book writing pedigree before joining this show, which I thought was a hilarious anecdote in and of itself.
That is funny. And I came across that too. And I think that points to, again, how little there is out there. It's like, if you search for this, you're probably going to come across the same handful of, of
you and
sites.
I read all of the same things. I'm pretty confident in saying that.
Okay. So here's the thing about the toys, and I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to talk about this. So not so much on this podcast, interestingly enough, but on my other show, My Comic Shop History, I've talked about this numerous times where, as much as I got into Superman comics with the death of Superman, I did have a Superman action figure that I had gotten in between 1987 when I was born and 1992 when I got the death of Superman. Somewhere in between there, I had the Superman action figure. And that was one of the reasons why when I saw the death of Superman, it meant something to me because I knew who the character was in some sense. And I've been kind of working under the theory that figure was the Kenner Superpowers Superman figure. And I actually, years ago during law school, I went on eBay and I tracked down, and it's in the showcase behind me here. It's still in its package, the Kenner Superpowers Superman figure. But now I think that it was actually the Toy Biz line from 1989, the DC Superheroes line, that was actually the Superman figure. I mean, it's possible, but I think with the timing, it's more likely that it was the Toy Biz. Now, and people on YouTube can comment and correct me, but I believe that they use the same mold. Like they were basically the same, more or less the same version of the Superpowers figures. So if you were to just look at the figures out of the package, I don't know that it would really be much of a difference, I guess is my point. Sure. But the reason why I'm so glad you brought up the toys is that as a kid, I had this Lex Luthor action figure, and it was not the Kenner Superpowers Lex in the green battle suit. It was the businessman Lex in his blue suit with the black shirt underneath. And as I'm watching this cartoon, I'm like, oh, I'm like, that's where that comes from. So
that's incredible.
Yeah. So there you go.
What a twist. You were a fan the whole time, inadvertently maybe, and maybe tangentially, but still.
But you know what? That's
incredible.
Fan, like it's weird to finally be able to get some context for that action figure I had. So to answer your question, no, there was never, like there wasn't a Ruby Spears Superman, line that was, directly tied just to that show. But yes, there was this Toy Biz line of action figures. And at least when it comes to the Lex, that was right. That was the same version as the cartoon.
So that you talking about the whole licensing conversation is what kind of spurred that thought in my mind, right? Because especially in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, like why would you even have a cartoon show if you're not going to have toys and action figures for it, right? Yeah. So that's kind of what made that thought. And even I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but even when you watch the first episode and you see the Defendroids. Yeah. Boy, they literally just look like action figures. Like as soon as I saw that, I was like, that looks like an 80s action figure I could buy in a store somewhere. So I was very curious about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny because I went on eBay and I looked up the Toy Biz DC Superheroes Superman figure. And they're expensive. There's like, I mean, if you want to get it in the package, it's like 100 or 150. I was like, but I looked up the Lex and I was seeing it for like, I don't know, $10, $15 still in the pack. So I'm going to order that because I think that would be cool to have especially as a little memento after this episode.
For sure. That's awesome, man. That is really awesome. I have to look into that myself. Now, do they have a Jimmy Olsen with a super rad skateboard?
Unfortunately,
because that's
not.
I got to tell you that Jimmy Olsen in the show, he's got style coming in on a skateboard. I appreciate that,
He does. So let's talk a little bit more about sort of like the show big picture. Then we'll take a commercial break and then we'll get, I guess, more into the specifics of the episode. But And then we talked about the again somewhat of the production and who was involved in it. But again, I think what really does make this cartoon stand out is what I was getting at before, this idea that it represents at the time really the sum total of Superman's history. So, you know, when you watch the opening credits, it's a rearranged version of the John Williams score from Superman the movie. And the version of Clark that we get, even though we were in the comics, we were now post-crisis John Byrne, a very competent, capable, confident Clark Kent. We still got the more bumbling, soft-spoken, cowardly, you know, Clark in this cartoon. At the same time, the Kents are alive as they were post-crisis. And we get that businessman Lex. So he's not floating around in a green war suit. He's in his purple business suit. And, you know, Superman can't get enough dirt to put him behind bars. So you really get like this really interesting mix.
And again, I have you to thank after our exploration of all of these origin stories of Superman that we've done, that I can't ever watch a Superman property or origin story without immediately seeing it and being like, okay, so he's a baby in this one. His parents are alive, just like you laid out. So yeah, and they do, to the show's credit, that must have had a considerable amount of thought and research put into it that I appreciate, because you could tell that people did care. I don't think this is a show that was made without care. Right. As funny as that sounds. And I think that's what you just said is proof of that, because somebody knew enough to what was going on in the comics, what maybe DC's big picture idea was for Superman, and to kind of put all of these elements together, but still make it accessible to a kid who's still tuning in for the very first time. Maybe he's never even seen Superman before.
Yeah. And, you know, to your point, it's like, it would have been fascinating to be in that writer's room where they're trying to figure out, because I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, that's no small task, like, to their credit. Yeah. If you're, in theory, right, and again, given the fact that this came out on the 50th anniversary, I mean, I have to imagine this was the case. Like, if your marching orders are like, okay, come up with a cartoon that represents 50 years of the character's history. Yeah, it's like, what, you know, where do you, you know, lean into recent developments? Yeah. Where do you kind of pull back and go with maybe the more classic depiction that people are familiar with? I mean, you know, our core cast, right, is Clark, Lois, Perry, Jimmy. And that, I mean, it felt like I was right back in the George Reeves Adventures of Superman television series, like with that, you know, with that core group. And the opening narration is the same one that they use, virtually the same one that they used in the Adventures of Superman. But the narration is done by the narrator from the Super Friends cartoon. So
more powerful than a locomotive.
Yeah, and like, so they really pulled in so much, and again, we mentioned the Kents being alive, but at the same time, in this cartoon, you know, Clark has his powers, including flight, from the time he's a baby. So it really
one of the notes I have is like, one of the notes I have in those backup stories is, boy, nobody in Smallville really cares too much that he has these powers, huh? Because boy, you are right about that. It is just. Anything goes there in Smallville from the jump with him and his powers.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, it is cool that I think in a lot of ways, like, it is a pretty effective encapsulation of those 50 years. I mean, again, it really borrows from a lot. At the same time, it's the closest for people who are like really into, and I know many are, understandably, rightfully. I know for people who are really into the Christopher Reeve incarnation of the character and the first couple movies in particular, it's like as close to a Superman the movie animated series, I think, that you can have.
Without a doubt. And I think that I even read that it was by design that they were really going for the Christopher Reeves model as well, which makes sense for the whole kind of shared image and kind of brand that DC seemed to be going for at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we take a quick commercial break, and then we'll talk more, and we'll get into specific episodes, because there were a few things I really liked, and I do have a few favorite episodes, as I'm sure you do as well. And then there was also some stuff that I think we'll probably have some fun discussing. You know.
Oh yes.
Yes. All right. So we'll be right back. Shadadigans is a weekly podcast by dads sharing their fairly new dad experiences, and also just talking about whatever. Listen, relate, and laugh. I was a guest on episode 90, and it was a blast. One of the hosts is a multiple guest of this show, Justin DeVoe. To follow Justin's fitness and cosplay journey, follow him on Instagram at reallifelobo. And if you're interested in starting or continuing your own fitness journey, check out Iron and Honor on Instagram. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. I also hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. The support of my patrons enables me to produce this podcast, and patrons get rewards too, including exclusive episodes, advanced listens, and more. Sign up today and get instant access to the back catalog. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all of my patrons. I truly appreciate your support. All right, so we are back. Now, you and I talked about this the last time you were on the show, but you are an actor, and you've done some voice acting, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, I sure have. I've done a little bit of everything. I've been lucky in that regard, but primarily for video games, I've done some voice acting and some not really any animation per se. I did a few little just kind of like fan projects for fun that people threw together, which was good fun. But I love voice acting. Me and my wife still are just such huge fans, both of us, of so much animation. We're big Adventure Time fans as well. When we got married, the song that actually played right when we got married at the altar was the closing credits theme from Adventure Time. So we're a very big like animation voice acting family, which is also why I was so excited to jump on this episode with you.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool to hear.
Yeah.
Well, so kind of on that note, so, I mean, you're a great person to ask then. I mean, I guess my general big picture question is, what were your thoughts about the voice acting? And then specifically with respect to Lex Luthor, because I feel like this was a real specific take on Lex. So, so I'll throw it to you. What were your impressions of the vocal performances on the show?
Could not have given me a better setup too. Unsurprisingly, we're pretty much on the same page here. So the voice actor for Superman, who's I believe is Bo Weaver, I thought was fantastic. I thought he did a wonderful job playing Superman. I could very easily be the voice of Superman that I hear when I'm reading a comic book. I thought it was wonderful. However, Lex Luthor, when I was first watching, and I believe that was Michael Bell voicing Lex Luthor, it ended up being okay for me. But in that first episode, when I first heard him, I literally said, whoa, to nobody in particular. Because I was like, this isn't Lex Luthor. It really, and I think that's for me because of our age and growing up with a more contemporary takes on Lex Luthor. It was a very jarring, different take on Lex Luthor. Just from like the dialogue, the voice even, it was very different. And it grew on me, don't get me wrong. And I guess this is a good segue to mention this too. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Anthony. Is Lex Luthor in only 4 episodes of this series?
Yeah, I think I read that in one of the articles, and I think it is like 4, maybe 5, but that's it.
What happened there? That's another question we'll never get an answer to. And that's, I just don't understand why he would only be in 4 episodes and like not the last one.
That's a good question. I'll say this. One of the show's strengths, I think, was that they leaned into the John Byrne post-crisis businessman Lex, because it and especially for a kid's cartoon, I really do give them a lot of credit, because it's like Superman doesn't, Superman stops Lex's schemes, but he can never fully bring Lex to justice. Mm-hmm. And again, especially for a kid's cartoon, it's like the hero wins, but not fully. And I think that was a really, really cool thing to be able to show. So I like that a lot. I mean, as far as, the extent to which they used him, I don't know. It's funny, and I know we touched on this before, but when you look at the villains who were used, so one of the episodes that I believe you did not have on Tubi, our future sponsor. I wonder how many times we have to say Tubi before we'll get a sponsorship.
If anybody here wants to just put us in touch with the people at Tubi, we'll give you a shout out on the show. I'm not authorized to say that, but I think Anthony would be okay with that.
That's perfectly fine. I'm still waiting for the DC people, the DC Universe Infinite app, whatever that's called. I'm waiting for them to call.
They probably have just been trying to call, and we've probably just missed it. Is probably what happened if I had to make a guess, so.
All right. Well, I'll say this real quick. Because DC Comics, I don't know how much faith I necessarily have in the publishing company at the moment. And I'll just kind of leave that there. But that's why I'm so happy with this podcast, that we're taking we're really looking at Superman the character. Like, I'm not just looking at one specific era of the comics or one comics run. And for those podcasts that do, I'm not knocking that like in the slightest. That's totally cool. But it's like I'm happy to be looking at the character as a whole across time and media, because it's not tied to one company and one company's decisions at the moment.
Part of our folklore.
Exactly. Anyway, that was my quick little tangent there. So one of the episodes that I think you didn't have on Tubi was Triple Play, the prankster episode.
That's the one with I was going to say the prankster. Not the trickster, weirdly enough, but the prankster.
Yeah, exactly.
How many of these little rascals are running around the DC universe, Anthony? You know?
I know. Well, so Triple Play is just real quick is the episode where the prankster steals the World Series. He transports the teams playing in the World Series along with a judge who put him away, Lois, Jimmy, and Superman to this island and forces them to play baseball. Yeah,
I mean, typical villain plan.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. Yes.
But I bring it up because that's one of the. There aren't a ton of episodes that utilize recognizable villains from the Rogues Gallery. I mean, we get Lex a handful of times. We get Prankster in that one episode, and that was a decent. It was fine. I'm not the biggest Prankster fan, so I don't think you missed that much. But that was an episode where we got a recognizable villain, and then probably my favorite episode, and we could talk about it, more later. But the Hunter, where they actually use Zod.
My man.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I have a tie for my favorite episode, but part of that tie is The Hunter. That's probably the strongest episode overall.
What's the other one? I agree
with you. The other one's kind of a cop-out, but I think it's the last episode just because it's so crazy. The last time I saw Earth. That episode is the work of crazy people, and I love it so much. It's crazy for a Superman show. I mean, my goodness. Hunter is, I think, objectively the best episode. Like bananas, especially as a last episode. Like that does nothing as a finale to tie anything with a bow. Lex Luthor's not even in it. And it's just, it's crazy. He goes to like not only another planet, but through a black hole to another dimension. And then he's in like a Mos Eisley-esque like space bar having a fight where he has one of my favorite lines in the entire series. This whole alien bar fight breaks out and Superman just goes, "I like this place." It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
It is. And so, so that's the thing. It's like most of the episodes utilize some of those other villains, like I mentioned, like Bone Chill, who has this talisman that allows him to, conjure mummies and other supernatural creatures, which oddly have no effect on Superman, despite magic being a weakness.
That was going to be my question too, man. Because like, why else would you have a magic villain in a Superman story? Because it's like, okay, we've done the kryptonite already. What's his other weakness? It's magic. It's right there, and that's why you have a magic villain or a magic entity. I would think
it was like a double reversal because or maybe just a reverse, because when that episode unfolded, I was like, oh, that's going to be his challenge in this episode because it's a supernatural threat. And then he uses his powers against these creatures and they turn to smoke and that was it. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's
Isn't that where they just have to hit like the middle of them, like the giant glowing. It's like the old like cliched video game thing. You have to hit the middle glowing part to destroy them. But that's, my goodness. Yeah, that was very silly. So the Hunter was a cool villain though. Yeah. I like that whole kind of super adaptoid / absorbing man kind of idea. That's always very fun to me to see in action.
Yeah. So the Hunter. So I'll say this because I know we directed people to Tubi and other places or like the DVD where they can watch these episodes. But if you were to pick one, I would say the Hunter. I would say watch the Hunter.
I agree. You'll get no pushback from me. And then please go watch The Last Time I Saw Earth because it's the work of crazy people and I love it so much.
Yeah.
But yes, you are right. The Hunter is, I think, the standout of the series.
The Hunter is the best one. So that's episode 7. And so Ma and Pa Kent are visiting Clark in Metropolis. And so we get, I think there are 2 instances where we get the Kents in the present day, not just in the vignettes.
Yes, I believe that's correct. You are correct, though. This does begin with them visiting him. I believe they're in the zoo. It's like a zoo park in the beginning of the episode, right? And Superman has to keep leaving them, but of course that endangers them. And I think they get kidnapped in a helicopter at one point. And there's just like a lot going on in that episode.
Yeah. Well, I think you might have mentioned a couple of things that have to do with the big scoop.
Oh, is that the one? So maybe you're right. In the big scoop, maybe they get put in the helicopter. Is that what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, well, let's circle back. Let's circle back to the big scoop because that was actually
Yeah.
that would be my tie, the Hunter and the big scoop for my
In the big
favorites.
scoop? Okay.
Yeah, but so in the Hunter, so Ma and Pa are visiting, and then Zod in the Phantom Zone, he's there with two unnamed females. You know,
Yep.
Ursa, Feora. We don't know. They're not named. I don't believe. Maybe they might be in the credits, although I don't know. I didn't check.
I
Um,
didn't either. That's a good point. We could probably look that up.
But
But yes, good point.
so they're there in the Phantom Zone, you know, devising a way to enact their revenge on the son of Jor-El, their jailer. And so they come up with they create this creature, the Hunter,
Yep.
who can actually you know puncture the barrier between the Phantom Zone and the real world, and has the
Hmm.
ability to you know take on the properties of different materials, including kryptonite. And, you know, so Superman has to fight him, and he ultimately, the Hunter gets his hands on Lex's kryptonite and turns into this kryptonite being, and Superman fakes his death. And so we go through this. I mean, it plays out in like 30 seconds, but basically,
It's
there's a,
wild.
yeah, there's a period of time where like the world thinks Superman's dead, and then he had given Lois this device to revive him, and then he's able to beat the Hunter. But it was pretty cool. Like it really kind of ran the gamut of emotion. Like there's a lot going on in that one.
And that one, I think, also aside from just being an interesting story and a lot going on, does have a lot of those elements where you could be like, "This is a Superman story," right? Because you have Mom, Pa, Kent, you have General Zod, you have the Phantom Zone, you do have the cast of Daily Planet that you're expecting, but that ends up being, I think, more of a rarity throughout this run than not, which I think is also a very peculiar choice as well. So I think this one really does check all the boxes.
Well, and so that's the thing. Like and you know, not to play Monday morning quarterback decades later, but it's like, especially for a show that ostensibly was meant to encapsulate 50 years, you would think that they would use more of the recognizable rogues. And I think that was one of the reasons why I kind of had a hard time getting into some of these episodes.
Hmm.
You know, like when we're talking about, you know, Wild Shark, this pirate in the Bermuda Triangle who, you know, who's, you know, capturing
So
ships.
boring. He's just so boring.
Yeah, and so it's one of those things. I mean, you know, and that's not to say that I'm opposed to a new villain if it's a really compelling one with a good story. But if it's not, it's like even. I mean, I think the Hunter Zod story was really. I think that was really solid in and of itself. But even if it had been a little more lackluster, at least it's a Zod story.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
you know, with a lot of these, you don't have it. So that's why, you know, I know I had messaged you and I was like, and I'll, you know, I'll share with the audience. That's my promise here. I mean, it's not like I'm coming on the show to like gush about everything that I'm reading and watching. There's some stuff that like doesn't really hold up. And I'll be honest, as I was making my way through these episodes over the past few nights, well, let me say this: they don't fly by. I don't know what your take was, but it, you know, the main story is only like 18 minutes, but it felt like it. It really felt like it.
I'm an older man than I was before I took this task on.
You know,
Is what I feel like.
like I sat down to watch these and I'm like, it's a cartoon. And I'm like, once you know, because the vignettes are, they're their own little thing. And weirdly on the DVD, I don't know, you might like this, you might not. I'm kind of split on it. They bifurcate it. So it's like they'll give you, you know, destroy the Defendroids. You can click on that to watch. And then the adoption. There's actually no option, I guess, unless you play all. But there's otherwise no option to like watch the entire episode together.
Oh, interesting. What an interesting choice. Because yeah, on Tubi, it's all just forced upon you for better or for worse.
Yeah.
You know, I'll share with you this anecdote here. Longtime listeners of this show will know that I love being prepared. Even though it's a Superman podcast, maybe that's the Batman in me. But I love being prepared and having copious notes. I got to episode 5 of this show, and I just had to stop taking notes at some point because it just got to the point where I was like, I'm just writing down the same thing over and over again, but like with a different character. So I had to stop. It was, you're right. The initial A side stories are only 18 minutes, but some of those episodes, boy, do they feel long. They really do feel long. And I think a lot of that has to do with the pacing. And perhaps that's also why maybe The Hunter is the standout because a lot is happening. But that episode does seem compared to the others, do a very good job of moving you from point A to B to C to D to E, as opposed to the other ones are just like, here's a bunch of stuff that are happening. And it kind of really took me out whenever the show spends a lot of time on the Clark Kent, goof bumbling. And that would happen multiple times in some episodes. It would just be like, okay, let's move it on. Let's move it along.
So that was so funny about the notes. I mean, I get it, and I'm glad you stopped. Honestly, I would have felt bad if you were like, I took copious notes on all these episodes. I would have been like,
I got to 5 episodes, and I was like, enough's enough. I'm hurting myself at this point.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I fell asleep during the Wonder Woman episode. I was struggling. Mm-hmm. I was struggling hard during that one. It's Wonder Woman, but I couldn't do it.
By the way, I found out, and you probably read too, based on some of the stuff that we found, was supposedly based on the George Perez version of Wonder Woman as well too, which I think is also interesting. It goes back to our point that this show was made with care, and some people obviously did have care about it. So I don't want to sound like we're just dismissing it, but listen, when my daughter took her naps during the day, and we're talking about like 12:30 in the afternoon, folks, I would put it on. And there were times where I dozed off too, and the episode would be over, and I'd have to go back to square one. So I'm right there with you. It's very difficult. It's a good thing that they're free on Tubi.
I mean, and here's the thing, for anyone who's listening or watching as we're talking here, who grew up watching this, I'm sure you have a personal attachment to it, and you're probably like, no, like these are gems. And that's, I mean, again, as I've said in other instances where I haven't liked something, I wish I did. I really, I mean, honestly. And I will say this too. I mean, we're spoiled that we really came up with Superman the Animated Series by Bruce Timm.
Boy, are we spoiled. Yes.
And if you go back to the 40s, though, those Fleischer cartoons were gorgeous. And I mean, I talked about those in an earlier episode, and I'll do another episode like fully focused on the Fleischers. But I mean, those were so beautifully animated. I mean, and they hold up, like they're gorgeous.
Are those on HBO Max or the DC app by any chance? Do you know?
I think they're on Tubi. They're on Tubi. No, I think they actually are.
People are going to really think that we're secretly sponsored by Tubi, and I'm here for it. I want you to know that.
I know. I want to say I'm so grateful for the sponsors I have. Honest, and you heard a commercial about the Shadadigans podcast and Iron and Honor Fitness. My buddy Justin. I want to show this watch that Justin got for me. For anyone who's watching on YouTube, he sent me this Superman watch. It's gorgeous. So thank you, Justin. I'm grateful for the sponsors we have. I'm certainly open to others, but yeah, no, we have no connection to Tubi. But I think the Fleischers are there. They're available. Like I actually have them on the like the Superman movie anthology Blu-ray that collects all the Christopher Reeve movies and Superman Returns and like a bunch of other like odds and ends, and they're all on there. So you can watch them in a bunch of places. But those Fleischer cartoons were really special. But I think they're kind of an outlier. Then in the 60s, you have the Filmation cartoon, which, again, if you grew up with it, I'm sure you have an attachment to it. I don't know that so I think that, I don't know how well they hold up. So I think that this cartoon actually was a big step forward, and maybe in some ways, especially with the industrialist Lex, I mean, maybe paved the way a little bit for what we would get in the Bruce Timm cartoon. So,
sure.
Again, there's value there, but yeah, there were times where it was a little bit of a slog, but
yeah. I'm going to take us a little bit of a left turn here, and to anybody who doesn't enjoy video games, I promise this won't be long, but just bear with me. I had a really good talk with my friend Kevin, who I often do about such things, who's a very like-minded individual like we are, and he sent me a meme that basically was just a picture of GoldenEye, and it said, "Still better than Fortnite." And GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64 was, again, it'd be hard-pressed to find people our age who either love it or at the very least know it and understood that it was a very big deal when we were growing up in the 90s. However, I told him, objectively, that's not true. Fortnite is a much better game than GoldenEye, but it's that nostalgic bias. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there are people who have an emotional, nostalgic attachment to that show, and that's valid. That is completely valid, and I understand that because you and I are very clearly like that about many things as well. So I don't want it to sound like we're dismissing that, but if we are trying to look at things objectively in 2021, it's just things have progressed and advanced to a point where it's not the same quality and storytelling that we are accustomed to, and we're spoiled in that regard. I think as well too, certainly. But I think that just needs to be said.
Yeah, I agree. And but I will say this, as far as like where I think there were strengths with this show, I thought, and tell me what you think. I mean, as far as the animation itself, I thought it was strong.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it looked good. I thought it was. I don't know if I'd say timeless necessarily, but there was nothing about it that offended me.
Yeah.
I had no like glaring problems with the animation or anything like that. So yeah, I thought it was fun. I thought they did some cool things with colors, like when he would go into space, and as they got weirder and more trippier, kind of with some of their stories. I thought it was kind of cool to see kind of like these different artistic kind of renditions of maybe something magical, or maybe the black hole sequence. I thought was actually pretty cool for the time period as well too, where people really the artists got to stretch their legs a little bit, so to speak, and kind of, play around with some different things.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, I mean, I think the animation was solid. I think the score was great. And I agree
Yes.
with you about the voice acting, and especially with Bo Weaver. And I think the difference in his performance when he's Clark versus Superman, I think he really, did what he needed to do for the role. I agree with Lex. I mean, I don't know what the best description is, like, for anyone who hasn't watched it, but he just struck me. He sounded like a used car salesman.
Without a doubt, nail on the head. It's like he was, I don't know if we have any Better Call Saul fans here, but he reminded me of kind of like those like early morning, like late night lawyer commercials, that kind of shyster, which isn't not a bad take necessarily for what they were going for, I suppose. But for somebody who grew up with the material at the time in the place that we did, it is definitely a very jarring departure to kind of hear that voice and that writing as well.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to, we're talking about the bumbling Clark, and because I was really thinking about this, and I've talked in other episodes. I prefer a mild mannered Clark is fine, but I think the bumbling is too much. And but it's funny to me. I was thinking about this. So this came out in '88, so this was the 50th anniversary, and yes, for the time, this did represent the way Clark had been depicted generally, right? But it's like now we're decades past that. And when you look at virtually every incarnation, we have gotten really like that John Byrne post-crisis Clark. You look at Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, even Smallville. I mean, at the very end, when he really adopted like the Clark Kent reporter persona, even then it was a little bumbling, but still more kind of on the mild-mannered side. But that did still kind of play into the Christopher Reeve a little bit. But the Henry Cavill version, the version that we're getting on Superman and Lois, like he's not like tripping over himself all the time.
Right.
So it's just funny to me that it's like, yeah, at the time in 1988, the bumbling Clark was most representative of the history of the character. But now, decades removed from that, if you were to do a cartoon to represent the past few decades, not the entirety of the character's history, I do think the more confident Clark would be the one you would go to. And I'm happy for that. But it was just kind of interesting to be like, yeah, at the time, but now that really has shifted.
And my problem has always been this. If we're looking at what Superman is really doing as Clark Kent, what does he have to gain by being bumbling and doing that? It's basically a simplistic way of him saying, hey guys, I'm not Superman so much that I'm also clumsy and kind of a dope. It just seems like an unnecessary step where why can't he just be a good reporter, a good human reporter who's good at his job? And I would even argue it's smarter that way because he's drawing less attention to himself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you and I, we talked about the miniseries American Alien when we did our post-crisis origins episode. And, there's a great bit in that where, Pete Ross and Kenny Braverman visit Clark in Metropolis. They know his secret and they say, like, don't people ever like recognize you? And he's like, you know what people say to me? You look like Superman. And that's it.
And that's it. Right. Because you wouldn't think of it as long as you're not drawing overt attention to yourself. And that's something that's always kind of stuck with me. So I'm in full agreement as well. I prefer a competent, cool, and collected Clark Kent.
Yeah, man, same here, 100%. And I guess it also kind of speaks to like the way, and I know we talked about this, but like the way we look at the character and who he really is. And I think, if Clark is who he is, and that's who he grew up being and who he was raised to be. And so it's like, he's just a reporter. Like when he's Clark, he's just living his life.
Yeah. It's not a secret identity. That's him.
That's just who he is. But I think, with this bumbling Clark, the thing I always come back to, and I know this is maybe bordering on nitpicking a little bit, but, we're examining these aspects of the character. I just think about what needless effort you would have to expend in order to keep up this act. And you look at like some of the instances where like he really has to bend over backwards, like while he's trying to save people, like while there's all this stuff going on, to try to keep his secret. And it's like, at a certain point, if this were real, it's like wouldn't you be like, this is not worth my time? It's too much.
Yeah. Hey, did you see that guy knock over all those coffee mugs? He's definitely not Superman. I mean, it's silly. It gets to a point where, like, you're right, it's unnecessary effort where just laying low and being himself and being like, hey, like this guy is really smart, which I think is something that's often way too, and we've talked about this briefly, but we overshadow this. And I think a lot of that has to do with his partnership with Batman as well, who often, Bruce gets paired as often as the brains of the operation. But Clark is a very smart and very intelligent person and very capable as well too. And I also find it hard to believe that with that in mind, that would Perry White hire this bumbling journalist, or would he hire like this guy who might not have the traditional experience in a lot of the tellings, but presents himself as a very intelligent, focused, and capable person? I mean, that's another wrinkle to kind of add to it too, if we're telling a truthful story.
Well, and to your point, in your set, we're tied for your favorite episode, the last one where the space shuttle gets taken by aliens who want to eat humans because their proteins will make them immortal. That was the premise of that episode.
It's the work of crazy people. It's fantastic.
But there's this point where, Clark and Perry are like watching the news and Perry wants Clark to go on the shuttle too, something like that. And Clark is like, no, like I'm too scared. And Perry's like, listen, son, like you gotta get some courage here. But exactly to your point, it's like, well, but you hired this guy. So if he's such a coward,
why
what
would
are you doing?
Keep him around? Yeah. Like, why would you bring somebody like that in staff who won't go do the assignments that you want him to do? And that's the thing. And I think it also kind of just lessens his character overall too, because there is more of an element of truth, right? To me, it feels like it's not a secret identity. He is Clark. He is Clark as much as he is Superman. And that what plays into the whole beautiful duality of the character that I think is very, very unique, even among many other dualities and quote unquote secret identities in comic books, is that this isn't some persona or guise he puts on. This is Clark is just as valid and just as real in many more ways, maybe even more so than Kal-El and Superman, especially depending on which rendition of the character that you're reading. And him doing these actions to Bumble seems like he's actively lying to people. And that seems, to me at least, a little bit against the core of who I think Superman should be.
You hit the nail on the head. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's the issue. That's like the main issue that I have with it. But in any event, this is very much the Christopher Reeve bumbling Clark that you get in animated form. So it's like if you're into that, you definitely get that here. Or speaking of other similarities to Superman the movie. So of course, an iconic scene from the movie is when Superman takes Lois flying, right? And that's how the series opens. In the first episode, he's taking her flying. And if I'm not mistaken, it happens twice more. Yeah, I think it's in the Wonder Woman episode where it begins with them flying, right?
I believe so. I believe that's correct.
And there's another, and it's funny because I was watching this and, you watch the first episode and you see them flying and it's like, okay, like clearly we are evoking the Superman the movie, like this iconic scene. Design. It's like, okay, cool. Then it happens again. And it's like, okay, fair enough. You want to reinforce that. But then it happens yet again. And it's like, all right, listen, it's too much. I feel like you're undermining the impact here.
And also, like, is there some kind of edict that says like they can't be like explicitly dating or in a relationship? Because that was a whole thing that was very weird to me. More weird than them just being friends or being in a relationship. It was this weird, like both but not either situation.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny because, you mentioned before about Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. And again, I am going to cover that on the podcast, not part of this miniseries, but down the line. And my wife she's a fan of it. And so I think we'll do like a little husband and wife kind of look back at the series. But
that's great.
I not to get ahead of myself, but I think we do have to kind of like tip our hats to that show for finally fully leaning into the romance aspect of all of this.
Sure. I'll concede to that.
Because you look at all of these prior incarnations and it's like they, Superman 2 is, I guess, the one exception to that where, he actually does attempt a relationship with Lois. But, for the most part, like Adventures of Superman is exceedingly chaste. Like there's like they barely ever even hint at anything. And then you get stuff like here where he's flying with her, but like it never progresses. And so Lois and Clark, I think, really kind of move things forward. I think on that front. But the other thing with him flying with her is like, how do I put this? It's like, is this guy's only move? Like, and does he not?
They have a sky picnic, right?
Yeah.
Which is also, that's worse somehow. It's like, what are we even doing here? It's,
yeah.
But that's the thing. They're very clearly going on dates, but then they also say lines like, oh, I'm so lucky to have a close friend like Superman. And it's just, maybe they weren't comfortable with in a kid show being like they were in a relationship for whatever reason. And this kind of goes back to our big overreaching theme of we wish we were behind the scenes for all of this, because I really think that whole behind the scenes story is probably infinitely more interesting than the actual product itself, because there's just so many choices that raise more questions that we won't get the answers to.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because that's a question that I've had for a while. And I brought this up when Rich Roney and I talked about Adventures of Superman many, many episodes ago, because there too, it's like Clark / Superman, like never even seems to really entertain the notion of dating Lois or anyone really. And similarly here too, I agree with you. Like they really kind of dance around it. It's like they're going on all these sky picnics and flights. It's like that seems to be beyond like a friendship, but they won't, go beyond that. And it's like, yes, I assume it's to protect the children, quote unquote, but it's like, I guess why? I mean, if he were dating her, it's like people date even, we're talking the late 80s here. We're not, it's not like it was that long ago.
Yeah. It's not like, 60, 70 years ago here.
So it's like, what would have been so scandalous about that? I don't know.
I don't know. It makes me wonder the edicts that were coming down from DC at the time too. It definitely seems like they wanted a certain kind of vision and image. And I wonder if that decision about their kind of relationship or non-relationship tied into that as well too. Kind of, related to that note as well too. I don't love how they handled Jimmy Olsen through this whole thing. I felt like they didn't really give him anything to do for the most part. And he was just there because they were like, well, if we're celebrating 50 years of Superman history, we have to have Jimmy Olsen. Where Jimmy Olsen, when he's at his best, can be such an integral and interesting part of the whole Superman mythology and story, and just a fascinating character in his own right. But he really was just a sounding board for Lois throughout this show, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that character was very underserved and underutilized. I mean, I would argue, you could probably argue like even Perry had like a little, at least he had the episode where he and his wife were on the cruise and they got taken by Wild Shark.
Yeah, there were stakes involved with him there. Yeah.
And on the note of Jimmy, I know I mentioned this when I did my mini-sode months ago, but I feel strongly enough about it that I'll mention it again, because I feel like, and going back to, the ruse that, that Superman carries on about his dual identity, I feel like this was so messed up in the episode By the Skin of the Dragon's Teeth, that episode, where there's this, ancient dragon that attacks.
I think I know exactly where you're going, and I love it already.
To protect his identity, Superman creates this stone statue of Clark and says, yeah.
How? First of all, how? Sculpture, super sculpture is not one of his powers. I don't think. Yeah.
You never read that? Yeah. You never read that story? Oh yeah.
I missed that one, man. I missed it.
So he creates this stone sculpture of Clark, and he's like, "Oh, the dragon turned Clark to stone," and poor Jimmy Olsen has to carry this stone statue of a grown man on a bicycle This guy's pedaling with this stone statue behind him. Like, if you're Superman, you got to protect. You can't come up with anything else. This poor kid. I felt bad for Jimmy in that episode. That was messed up.
It was messed up. One thing about that episode, though, I'll say this, that I did enjoy, and I did jot down in a note before I tapped out vigorously, was with no shame, was I did like that was the only episode where we saw Clark and Luthor having to work together, even briefly, to defeat that dragon, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I saw that and I was like, maybe there's a little bit of hope here for this show. Maybe, we get more of these, the enemy of my friend, or for the greater good, we have to work together, where they see even briefly that when they are using their very different, but I would also argue complementary skill sets to each other, that they are actually very effective. And this is a far cry from their relationship in Smallville. That's obviously very, very well documented. But just that little nugget, which ties into Operation Nugget, which, by the way, silliest name for an operation ever. I guess that's me nitpicking, but ridiculous. But I thought that was kind of cool that you do kind of have that very brief moment where they are forced to work together in that episode.
Well, that's the thing. That was one of the things I had jotted down too. There are moments where they're like just touching on something really interesting. And it's like, I wish we, and I guess going back to the relationship aspect in the Bone Chill, I think it's the Bone Chill episode. Clark has his alumni reunion at college, I believe, and he invites Lois as his date, and she accepts. And she's like, "Oh, are you asking me as your date?" And she goes, and then he's stepping on her feet and all that stuff. But it was like, oh man, I would have we could have cut out all the Bone Chill stuff. I would have loved to just spend a little more time.
Yeah, give me an episode about their relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, look, and for anyone who's like, hey, it's a kid's cartoon, I get it. I'm not expecting that they actually would do that. But it's just like there were those moments where it's like, oh, like we're like really close to something here. I mean, that would have held my interest as an adult in 2021.
Think about years later what a show like Justice League and Justice League Unlimited would do, though, with character relationships. I remember completely believing and understanding the relationship of Green Arrow and Black Canary, even if I had never read a Green Arrow comic and I wasn't a fan. Like, they did a good job of establishing that relationship. So maybe it just was maybe they just weren't there and weren't ready yet in like the timeline of where things were going. But again, to your point, like, they are on a date, and they are very much explicitly on dates throughout this run. So it's just a very confusing decision. It's almost like there was some kind of internal power struggle or conflict where somebody was like, they're a couple, they need to be together. And somebody was like, no, they can't date. It's a children's show. And it's this weird kind of, like I said before, both but neither kind of situation.
Yes. And I think, that does create, it is just sort of like this weird gray area that it lives in. So let's take one more quick commercial break. And then, there are a couple of other funny bits and one big picture question about the vignettes that I want to ask you. Cause I've been trying to wrap my head around this one aspect and about like what their overall moral or message might be. And so I want to ask you about that. So we'll take a quick commercial break.
If you have superpowers, you can do bad things. That's the
okay. So all right. As always, you and I are on the same page. We'll be right back.
My goodness.
The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. All right, and we're back, and thank you to all of our sponsors. Really do appreciate it. So one of the funny things that came to mind, I think about this a lot too when I watch the George Reeves Adventures of Superman show too, and I don't know why I don't know why I always think about this, but maybe it's because in my in my prior job, as you and I talked about on a recent episode, I did a fair amount of traveling because we had to do a lot of recruitment, and I would have to submit expense reports and things like that. So maybe that's why I always think about it. But I always think, like, watching the George Reeves show, watching this cartoon, it's like, what the hell kind of budget did the Daily Planet have? Because, like, they're always sending multiple reporters, like, on location on these big trips. And in this cartoon in particular, you think about how many news vans and news choppers get destroyed. And it's like, they don't even seem to blink an eye. I couldn't get past that.
What do you think the reimbursement claim looks like for sending somebody into space? Because I'm actually now in a position where I also request for reimbursement when I do have to travel as well too. So yes, I'm very familiar. And they do say in the beginning that if this isn't one of the tales where it's like a struggling or a dying, they do say a great metropolitan newspaper, which I actually thought was kind of funny in the beginning. Like there's a little plug for the Daily Planet in the beginning there, calling it a great institution. But yeah, apparently they're doing really well. You know what? The internet isn't really in a boom yet. Print is still doing well, so I guess they're living high off the hog over there in the Daily Planet, just throwing all this money to the wind.
I know. No, I mean, I really do think that, in large part, I think that does account for it. That, it really was a different time, and I think journalism, thankfully today, I think is valued and people do recognize its importance. Journalism, but as far as like the actual like operation of the newspaper, it's like, yeah, I don't think I can't imagine that they have those sorts of expense allowances that they seem to have in these stories that we're talking about. But it's so funny. It's so funny to me with that.
It is. It's a very, very good point as well too that I actually hadn't considered even until you just brought that up. But yeah, I mean, it's wild. Perry White is just out there making it rain left and right.
One of the other things is, and again, I hope people know that, this is all in good fun. It's not to pick it apart, but at the same time, it's like watching, there's some things that they just really make me laugh. So I said that one of my favorite episodes was The Big Scoop, where Lex discovers Clark's secret identity, or at least he thinks he does. And then Clark has to figure out a way to, still preserve his identity.
By using smoke is how he solves some of that problem.
Yeah, well, smoke and Pa Kent in a Clark Kent mask.
Which is that not just the craziest ending to an episode? Like what?
What's so funny is I was watching that, and Lex is convinced that Clark is Superman, and he puts Clark on television and arranges this disaster. And the only way that Clark can stop it is to reveal his identity on live TV and change into Superman.
Which, to be fair, is a good plan.
Yeah, for sure. And that obviously doesn't happen. And, Clark remains in the studio somehow as Superman saves the day. And then Superman rescues Clark, quote unquote Clark. And it turns out that it's Pa Kent in this, girdle and mask.
The girdle. Yep.
It's like right out of the MCU and Black Widow and these masks that you can, that you can wear. It
reminds me of, I don't know if you're a fan of the Mission Impossible series.
Yes.
But that's exactly what it brought to mind.
Yeah. But out of all of that stuff in that episode, and I did think that was a cool one, and because it challenged Superman in a different way, and
yes.
It really used Lex effectively. Like that was a standout episode. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool.
Out of the 4 that we got, that's the best Lex Luthor episode, I think.
Oh, you didn't like? Go ahead. You didn't like the Shadow Thief episode?
This is going to sound wildly disrespectful, and I apologize because I do not mean to disparage anybody who worked on this show. That seemed like it was written to me like 4:59 p.m. on a Friday. And people were just like, what if everybody was a shadow so Superman couldn't punch them? I mean, that episode is ridiculous. I don't want to say that's the worst one of the bunch, but it's the silliest, I think. And just that Lex Luthor, that's the last time we see Lex Luthor, is it not?
I believe so, yeah. Like he has this ridiculous gang. He has this gang of shadow thieves, and they all wear this suit. That one was.
Yeah, and then Lois gets stuck in it. It's like, oh no, if I stay in here for more than an hour, I'm gonna get stuck as a shadow. It just why? I just don't understand why.
Well, so related to that question of why, so the thing for all the stuff that happens in the Big Scoop episode, the thing that really made me laugh was. you know, the reason Lex is able to discover Superman's identity is he steals this Chronotron machine that allows the user to see an hour into the future. And so he sees Clark turning into Superman. But this device was developed by a scientist at the Smallville Institute of Technology.
World-renowned.
And I'm, I'm watching this. I'm like, for a small town, they have quite the science operation going.
You couldn't use Star Labs? Why didn't we just use Star Labs? Well, I just don't understand.
Why? Because we needed Pa Kent to be the decoy Clark.
To tie it all in. Yeah.
And that was how we did. And so that's an instance where, no, we were not in the writer's room, but you can see how they worked their way through that one, where it's like,
you could see they had the Pa Kent idea first, I feel like. Like, what if he played him? How do we make this all connect? So, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So, well, okay. So while we're talking about the Kents, again, I think you and I are on the same page. I want to talk about these vignettes because I'm a little troubled by them, I think. And maybe I shouldn't be.
Are we going to spend an entire new episode talking about that babysitter with him? Because I'm pretty sure I could talk for a while on just that alone. Because, my goodness, there is craziness. That babysitter even has a line where I believe she's like, "Oh, I know what to do with little boys like you." And I was just like, whoa, like, do I have to report this? Like, what's going on here? Like, and she's like, has that suggestive outfit on while she's watching young Clark. And I was like, you can't have Lois and Clark be in a relationship, but somehow this is all okay. Like, it just, and again, broad strokes, that's probably the least of the problems with the backups, but it was craziness. And yes, as we both alluded to, perhaps the more pressing factor than that awkward, uncomfortable moment was that Clark seems to use his powers in his youth without abandon, without restraint, without control, and without any regard to who may or may not see him. And that is something that I think is okay once, until Jonathan Kent intervenes and says, "Son, you can never, ever do something like that ever again."
Right, which doesn't happen until the third to last vignette. So, I mean, here's the thing. So we get 13 vignettes. And let me say this. Overall, I appreciate the idea of the vignettes. And like I said before, sure. I mean, you wouldn't expect that really in a Saturday morning kids cartoon.
Very unique. Very unique.
So it's a really, really cool angle. I mean, I've never liked the idea of him having powers as a baby.
Right.
And a toddler. I like them emerging as he's growing up. I mean, he's literally flying as an infant in this. That's too much for me.
That's how he got adopted.
Yeah, so exactly. So that piece of it is a little goofy. Nevertheless, that's really, if you had to sum these up, it's like Clark's powers get him into trouble, basically throughout his entire upbringing. And so, I mean, I won't list all of them, but I mean, we have, the adoption, and then Ma takes Clark to the supermarket and he's causing all this trouble. He has a Cub Scouts camping trip. He has a birthday party. He gets his driver's license. He goes on his first date. He graduates high school. And then finally he goes to Metropolis.
That's right.
As a side note, but it's related. The last one, right, where he goes to Metropolis, because you and I, obviously, we spent over 3 hours talking about the origins.
We sure did.
It's not my favorite, I guess, when Ma just gives him a costume and she's like, "Here." And he's like, "Okay, thanks. Bye." Which
it's like she's handing him a bag lunch. She might as well be doing that. Here you go.
Yeah. But it's so that's the gist of these vignettes. They're 4 minutes. Each one is a snapshot. Literally, they begin and end with a photo. It's the family photo album. So it's a snapshot of Clark's upbringing and, how his powers have gotten him into trouble. But I mean, I agree. So we are on the same page here. It's I'm watching these and it took me a while, but I'm episode after episode, he's just using his powers and there don't really seem to be any repercussions or lessons. It's like the birthday party, for example, they play, pin the tail on the donkey, but he uses his X-ray vision to see through the blindfold, right? Stuff like that. The driver's test episode, he uses his super senses and reflexes to ace the driving test sort of thing. And they're until we get to the football episode where Pa finally is "Listen, you can't use your powers. It's like an adult playing with children." And then Clark becomes the assistant
which is a good
coach.
line. That's a
Yeah,
good line, I think, to give them credit. Yeah.
right. So I
Yeah.
felt, yeah. It's
No,
a,
I
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
there's not enough. The consequence comes far too late, though, right? Because like, what kind of and you and I can speak to this as parents, young parents of young children as we are. If we see our kids doing something inappropriate or something that we don't think is right, we don't wait like a few years to start correcting them. Like this is much higher stakes when your child is a Kryptonian. So, my
Yeah.
goodness.
Well, so okay, so like here's where I have the even larger problem because I agree with you about that, but it's like okay, it takes a little bit too long, but Pa is finally like, listen, you can't do this. Okay, fine. But then in the final vignette where Clark makes his debut as Superman, he again uses his powers to get the scoop over Lois and get the
Why
job
though?
at the Daily Planet, and that's where
It's
they lost me. Because I
yeah,
felt
yes.
like, okay, at least if we had a progression and an evolution and a conclusion here, but I felt like they undermined what I think the lesson was maybe supposed to be. I don't know. So that they lost me there. I had a real issue with that.
Yeah, because I mean, A, it shows that he learned nothing, and B, that he's using his powers immorally, which is I think the biggest conflict with a Superman character you can have, right? I mean, he's supposed to be not perfect, but ultimately learns from his mistakes and always tries to be that example of trying to do the right thing. Here, we do not see him try to do the right thing consistently. We see his father give him advice. And as you just said, the last time we see him, he's using his powers to get one up on Lois. Why is he even doing that? Because he thinks he's going to impress her? Because he thinks he wants to make a splash at the planet? All those answers are unethical to me and don't ring true to my version of who Superman should be.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. So that was tough. That was really kind of tough to fully get. And like I said, it took me because I'm watching family album after family album, and I'm like, well, like what is the kind of the
Which,
point here?
by the way, I don't know if you thought about this as well, but again, considering we've spent a lot of time in Superman's 80s now, what is the obsession with these family albums? Because if you recall, some of my favorite comic book covers now of all time are Superman staring shockingly at these photo albums. But it seems to be such a motif in this time period where you're seeing them like prominently featured in every episode of this show on the cover of comic books. And I mean, I guess that could be a thing where it's a sign of the time, right? Where they want to show him that like we're looking into his history and that's like an image of it. But I just thought it was an interesting note. And I wonder even if the comics informed that was part of like the initiative, even like there's a similarity kind of him explaining his history but using that imagery of the photo album. As soon as I saw that photo album the first time, I thought immediately like, well, I've seen this a few times before already.
Yeah, I know that's true. We do get a lot of the photo albums, and I know specifically, when we talked about the post-crisis origins, it was, John Byrne did those World of Smallville, Krypton, and Metropolis miniseries, and the World of
Exactly
Smallville
right.
one in particular, but maybe multiple of them, right? Had had that photo album,
Yeah,
motif.
where Clark could not believe it was possible that his parents could have had romantic relationships before they met each other. The biggest shock of his life, apparently.
Yeah, learning that he was an alien was like wow, whatever. But it's
Yeah,
like ma, ma
still,
was ma was married.
still one of my favorite comic book covers of all time, and I have you to thank for that. So thank you.
My pleasure. I mean, I guess I have some other similar, nitpicks or funny bits about other episodes. But what else from the series overall or individual episodes? Like, what else stood out to you, or what else did you want to talk about?
I found a fun Easter egg that I'm curious to hear if you found as well too. So in the very first episode, the Defendroids, when all the newspapers get thrown with Perry White, one of those newspapers is the Daily Bugle,
Yeah.
which people might know as Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson's news outlet from the Spider-Man world and universe. I thought that was kind of a fun Easter egg. And boy, were they not afraid about lawsuits as much as they are now, apparently. Because could you imagine something like that happening now, today? Oh my goodness, never. It wouldn't happen. I thought that was a fun nod kind of though as well too, to kind of be like, hey, here's a little nod to another famous kind of comic book news organization. So I thought that was a kind of a nice little tip of the hat, little Easter egg that was in there as well. Aside from Easter eggs and little notes, just I want to say the show gets better when it leans into the ridiculousness, but it doesn't. I think it gets easier to laugh at, and that sounds terrible, but I think the fundamental problems are there in every episode that we've hit on already. From a lot of times, with the exception of The Hunter, I think, a lot of times that the episodes just are laborious to get to where they're going. The portrayal of the characters either seem untrue or they don't get enough time to kind of give them room for growth. Even in what you could say is a children's cartoon show over a couple episodes, you need to have something to sink your teeth into. And I feel like that's just what was missing from a lot of this show.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that. And I think that kind of sums up my overall feelings, towards this as well. Like I said at the top, I'm glad I watched it. I don't know really that I would be revisiting this. When my son gets a little older, honestly, I'd be more likely, to be honest, I'd probably show him Fleischer first because those were 10 minutes and they were really action packed. And I would probably start with that. And then when he's a little bit older, like I would just go to Superman, the animated series. So I don't know as far as the place that this might occupy in my overall Superman fandom. And I don't say this in a dismissive way, but I think a little bit more of a footnote. It's like, yeah, like there was this, I don't want to say weird, but I mean, just like this very short-lived Superman cartoon that wove together various aspects of the then 50-year anniversary, and again was the closest thing to Christopher Reeve in animated form as you might find. And there were a couple cool episodes, a lot of goofiness, a weird lack of recognizable villains. But I'll say this though, overall, I do think that as far as the characterization of Superman, it's a very pure, like classic take. And I don't really have any issues with the way the characters are portrayed. I guess it just would have been interesting to place them in more interesting dynamics and challenges.
I agree completely. And I think if I had to sum it up, that after they were looking for, the creators of the show and the powers that be, to create a comprehensive story over 50 years of Superman, to tell a cohesive tale that would attract everybody and pay homage to many different things. What they instead created was an oddity, which I think is so interesting to me because I think in a lot of ways, and this isn't even necessarily all negative as we discuss, I think in a lot of ways they created the opposite of what they sought to create to begin with. Because if you look at all the stuff that we're talking about, there are so many things that just are not typical of Superman and these characters and these situations and these environments. So I think this is a very interesting tale of setting out to create one thing, but ending up with almost the complete opposite as a result.
I think in our closing moments here, I think you came up with a take on this that is 100% spot on, and sadly, like tragic. I mean, again, we're talking about a cartoon. It's not the end of the world, but I think there is an element of tragedy there where it's like if the intention. No, I think you're so right, man. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's like, yeah, if you were trying to create something that would encapsulate 50 years, I mean, in theory, right? Like you're trying to create something that would be timeless in its own way, right? Because it's a little bit of everything, and yet it's the most forgotten, overlooked, as we said before, in the Superman catalog. So yeah, I mean, and why that ultimately is, I guess, you could have different interpretations, but maybe part of it is that it tried to be a little bit of everything, and maybe that was not the right recipe. Very, very, well said, my friend. That's I'll be thinking about that.
Well, I owe it to you because you always spurn these thoughts in my head as we go along, looking at kind of the big picture, and not only the big picture of the show, but we examine its place and kind of the Superman mythos and canon.
Well, and again, that's why I wanted to do it here in the midst of this miniseries. I mean, the rest of the episodes that we're going to be doing here in this 8-part event, they really are comics focused, but we are looking at this period overall. And again, with the exception of Superman 4, which was the end of a movie series, and Superboy, which was its own thing, and we'll talk about, like, this was the adaptation, the other media adaptation of the character at this time. So I thought it would be interesting. And again, like there are those elements of the Byrne comics that you see at play here. So it does kind of tie in, but again, this was not meant to, and I wonder, it would have been interesting, especially now having read all the Byrne stuff and having read ahead to what we're going to be talking about in upcoming episodes, to have gotten an animated series that was firmly based on that period, that wasn't trying to capture everything, but really had been about what they were doing post-crisis, would have been cool. Would have been really cool.
It would have been.
At the same time, it's cool in its own way. I suppose.
It's intriguing, not necessarily for the source material, but for what may or may not have gone behind the scenes to make it. And like we said, where it fits into the overall mythology and kind of timeline as we know it of Superman as a property.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say truly is, regardless of whether it was only intended to be 13 episodes or it got canceled, that doesn't really even matter so much, but it is shockingly short-lived when you look at everything else. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is the Krypton TV series on Sci-Fi a few years ago. But even that got 2 10-episode seasons. So, you look at everything else, the various animated series and TV shows and movie, like almost everything has had a longer life. So for either intentional or not, for this to only be a 13-episode cartoon series is very much an outlier in the Superman canon.
I still have not watched Krypton. You're going to make me watch that show, aren't you?
We'll add that to the list. I'll be covering that probably next year, so you have some time. But yeah,
there you go.
I do want to get to that. Well, listen, I thank you very, very much for watching all those episodes. Again, I know it was a little tedious at times, but thank you for watching, and thank you for all the insight you shared. I really, really enjoyed this.
Oh, me too, buddy. Me too. And thank you, as always, for having me. It's such a pleasure being here and talking to you. And I always learn so much when we get together and all the research and process. And I think in some ways, even though the product was what it was, it really was such an interesting study on its place and the questions we asked. I think it makes it worth an examination of itself. So it was a worthy look at this series.
Cool. Right on. Well, there you have it, folks. That was the 1988 Ruby Spears Superman cartoon. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure that you come back in 1 week for part 4 of our Crisis Till Death event. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group. Follow Digging for Kryptonite on Instagram and Twitter, and visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore more of my film and podcast projects.